Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
So, an article I recently came across from the historian John Fee caught my attention, Nathan, and immediately I alerted you and my dad because I thought it was emblematic of just another sign of our times. But so Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a Christian school, just slashed their entire humanities department. And this is a trend, it's a growing trend right now. And as the article points out,
bites the dust in my mind going on here. Because, I mean, yeah, it fits in with the pattern.
Yes, it does. And I'm going to link to the article in the show notes. It's worth taking a look at. John Fee basically points out that this is going to be happening more and more. Maybe not quite as quick, as swiftly as it did at Cornerstone University. It's more he thinks what's going to happen is you're going to have more and more Christian universities where you have humanities professors retire and they simply won't be replaced. And eventually they just phase out.
Okay.
This whole department. But let's just pause there.
Who cares?
We need to get into why is that bad? Why is that bad?
We need to get into the who cares here.
Who cares? Yeah.
Yeah. Because, I can imagine a lot of people listening to this being like, eh. So I think Cameron and I are going to try to make a case for why you shouldn't just say, eh. Or I don't know. I'm conflicted on some of this. So let me say this for starters, Cameron, is I have, lots of colleges and universities, as you said, have gone through this, and I don't fault them for that. It's a simple economics game of you're offering a product that nobody wants any longer. So it's not economically viable for an institution of higher education to continue to hire departments, faculty head, the administrative staff to run the whole thing that people aren't signing up for. But okay, so it's bad, but I don't blame the university or an educational system. Like it's a math game here. There's that. I think what the broader issue is what it says about our broader culture. So it's not just a problem with universities per se. It's this broader idea that maybe some of these traditional humanities type categories aren't really that important. And I'm guessing here that underneath the veil or thinly below the surface level here is the idea that we're rapidly trending in the direction that an education needs to be thought about in terms of its economic return on investment, which, if you think about it, is kind of true. That's why people save money to go to college, or parents spend money to get their kids a good education, as they say, we're making an investment in your future financial situation and economic outcome. And so really we need to see dollar signs on the other end of this in return. So I think that's the thing that's below all of this, is that we've commodified education down into merely economic terms to say which degrees are going to make us money. What are the things that we need to know in order to, flourish in the modern economy? And so I think that actually, summarize my meanderings here, that actually is the thing that's below this culturally speaking, not just within the university context, but that knowledge needs to have an economic return on investment in order to be useful knowledge. So I don't know. How does that little summary, is that too pessimistic, or is that kind of exactly what's going on?
It's not a pessimistic view. I think we've been operating with that. We've been in this paradigm for a while. We're just seeing it really played out much more consistently these days. And I'll go ahead and say that underwriting this paradigm is a thoroughly materialistic outlook. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who espouses it is necessarily a materialist. I'm saying they think like a materialist. If the only way you cash out value is in terms of some kind of market value, it's hard to draw any other conclusion. So so again, we'll just pause here for a second because I could easily go off on a rant on some of the stuff, but I don't want to do that because I want us to think about this. Because, some of us might be hearing this and thinking, later. But some of us might be hearing this and thinking, okay, Well, yeah, I don't want to. Materialism is not a good thing, since I'm a Christian and I believe, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything is charged with His grandeur and His significance.
We'll
But
we'll,
why
we'll
does this?
make this link a little
Yeah.
more
So
clear here.
why does that matter here? What's wrong with thinking practically about higher education? And the truth is, people do need to make a living, and so what's wrong with taking this approach? Well, let's think about what's covered in the humanities. What kind of majors these are, what kind of fields these are. We're talking about history, we're talking
Yeah.
about
Okay.
philosophy, and we're talking about English. Now, what's the problem with eliminating all of these? Well,
And
and
art,
oh yeah, art
probably, art
programs. Yeah, art
history, art.
programs that they also
w-
slashed, gone.
Yeah, music would be in those usually under
Right.
the arts. Yeah.
So how is the mind impoverished without those? And how does that affect, in particular, a Christian university? Oh, by the way, let's theology is also covered in the humanities.
Oh,
Just that
oh
little
yeah.
just that little department right there. One's called Queen of the Sciences, but that's another story. Well, what kind of, the phrase life of the mind, you know, presents itself here, Nathan. If you take away all of that, how do you even call Cornerstone University? And this is just one example. How would you even call them a liberal arts college? They still seem to insist on calling themselves a liberal arts college, but they don't
Mhm.
really school you in the liberal arts. They may have a couple of adjunct professors sort of doing their little due diligence, but essentially it's more of a kind of a tech school or a trade school or something like that. So that's just a technical point to make right
Well,
there.
well, so another technical point to throw in here is that most universities are not entirely scrapping their departments in these categories. They're scrapping them as
Hmm.
majors. So maybe you're a historically Christian school. You no longer have a religion or a theology department, but all of your students are still going to take intro to the New Testament and a theology course of some type over their 4 years there. So it's still sprinkled in there. You'll still get a history class, but it's not something that you would dedicate as a
Hmm.
major. So you can kind of fly the liberal arts flag and have people teaching that. But running a history 101 is different than having a history department for sure. So I think that's the way that some of the hairs are getting split in this breakdown of saying, "Oh no, we still teach these things. You just can't be a art history major or a English major. They're still important, but you just can't focus exclusively on that." So I think that's the dividing line that I see a lot of colleges using nowadays, to say, "Yeah, we're still liberal arts, but we don't have as heavy of an emphasis in these categories."
Yeah.
Sorry, I derailed you from your other derailment.
Well, but I think so. We're in a moment where just in our day-to-day lives, these kinds of pursuits are not really valued. They're seen as kind of novelties, I think. The person who still reads old books and
Okay,
yeah.
well, let me share the story. Like, we were just discussing this beforehand. So I had mentioned, um, what were we talking about? East of Eden, Steinbeck. And anyway, you picked it up and started reading it, and I was just getting your first reaction to beginning it, and you're like, "Oh, it has these biblical themes." He writes very much into, um,
These biblical
and
cadences and the
as I was listening to you to describe your impressions,
Mhm.
yeah, biblical cadences and themes and reverse themes of biblical. And I said, Cameron, look at, like, here's a perfect example. Say you grew up in a secular household and went to a school that didn't prioritize the humanities. You wouldn't have a framework of understanding, like, the impact of biblical literature on, like, Western literature. And you could read East of Eden as a story, but you wouldn't get the richness of what's going on if you didn't understand all of, like, for you to be able to pick out a biblical cadence in a classic American text means that you have to have an idea of what a biblical cadence is. So I said to you, look, East of Eden would be totally inaccessible to you in its depth if you didn't understand and didn't have a background in the humanities. And you said, yeah, but who cares about Steinbeck
Yes.
anymore? So I think actually maybe that's where you need to start defending the category of the Steinbecks and their value to humanity,
Hmm.
economically or not.
Yeah,
So start there for us. I think work help us work back of like why
sure.
should we care in the first
And
place?
I'm going to speak in different terms so let me just put it like this. There are times where to meet the critic on his or her own terms is a mistake because the terms are the wrong terms. So trying to say, so asking, how can I justify reading East of Eden by John Steinbeck, for instance, or take any other book, Homer's Odyssey or Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse or Jane Austen's Emma? How can I justify reading these things in economic terms? It's the wrong question. How can I justify studying these people in economic terms? Also, the wrong question. So, how do I spell out the value of reading books like this in economic terms? Or how do I spell out the value of studying these books in college at a formal level where you're paying for an education? It's the wrong question. So, why? So let's talk more basically. What actually is it that makes literature so valuable? Well, literature is all about, in the end, in broad terms, what
Art
it
in
means.
general.
Yes, I mean art in general. I'm going to take literature as a specific example since we're talking about we entered into this discussion with East of Eden, but it's about capturing human experience. And great literature, most art in general doesn't survive the ravages of time. The most ruthless of all critics is
Mhm.
time. So most of the books that come out in a given year, most of the paintings that come out, most of the films now, we could count film in there as well. Most of this stuff will never be remembered. We won't be reading, watching, looking at it in, years to come. That's just the way it goes. The stuff that we hold on to, we call timeless, or sometimes we use the word classic. Sometimes the phrase the Western canon is very out of fashion, but it's there to designate those texts that we've held on to. We're still reading Homer, we're still reading Shakespeare, and so on. Why? Well, because we have agreed, there's been a consensus that these are great works of art, and they're great works of art in part because they have captured some vital aspect of what it means to be a person. And I've always liked Ezra Pound's
Mhm.
phrase where he says, "Poetry is news that stays news." So, in other words,
Hmm.
yeah, it's really
Yeah.
that's
So
compelling.
that's a great example of a great line.
It is, and so certain, The Tempest by Shakespeare will never become obsolete in the same way that a flip phone did. So there are areas where you do have, so technology is an easy place to point. Certain older forms of technology become obsolete because they're replaced by better technology. But when it comes to understanding what it means to be a person, it doesn't work like that. Now, let me pause here because here's a big point of difference, Nathan, where a lot of people would disagree with me there. They wouldn't recognize, some people would, who are very explicit in their philosophical assumptions, would say absolutely no, that's not true at all. Human beings are evolving, we are progressing toward a greater stage of enlightenment, or however you want to phrase it. So yes, we can and should and must leave Homer and all of these ancient people behind. Maybe we study some of their pagan practices just for sort of the historical novelty, but certainly we don't want to say that we have anything to learn from them in that sense. No, we're moving toward a greater stage of enlightenment. So progressive lines of thinking don't
Yeah.
all get that
Well, see,
explicitly, but
but
plenty of them do.
yeah, but here's the thing: is like if you read the classics, they are in themselves the greatest proof that that's not true.
They are, but you have to, but see, Nathan, what did we just do? We're slashing humanities departments. So what are students not reading? I mean, how many young kids, or
Well,
how many college,
so
well, hold on, how many
I think there's
college age kids do you know who, if they have no precedent for it in their homes, of their own volition, are going to dive into difficult, challenging works of art, especially historically remote, challenging works of art? you need a guide for
or
that.
that take you 16 hours to read.
Right. I mean, you actually you need to be now. I think there will. Side note: there will always be people who do this because that's part of one of the perennial features of humanity is the love of wisdom and the love of knowledge for its own sake. That's never going away. There are times where it's a smaller group of people doing that, but that's a perennial feature of humanity. But this is where a lot of people who are in classical schools or kind of homeschooling movements do have a clear advantage because that is cherished usually in those circles. And we can talk about some practical benefits to this, but right now I still want to just focus on we have some deep seated assumptions about value and humanity, many of which have infiltrated the church that are totally foreign to Christianity. That's what I'm trying to get at here, slowly and
Yeah.
carefully.
Okay. Well, let me come at it at this angle and connect back to your materialism piece. Um, in that, boy, tell me if this is too much of a stretch. Is that there's almost a sense in which we're 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 back in this vision of craving survival, and we think it's a cutthroat world out there, and in order to survive, I need to have a good job. Which, okay,
Hmm.
that's true, but surviving is not the goal of your life. And there's a sense in which, when you have Jesus saying, "Hey, don't worry about, what you eat, what you drink, what you wear. The pagans run after these things. Seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all this other stuff will be added." There's a sense in which that we're doing a very complex modern version of that, where we're thinking about how do I have enough to eat at a time in which I think by 2050, like half of the world is going to be obese. So we
Hmm.
have like this fear of not having enough that drives us economically to amass stuff, which is all geared around our survival and success economically.
Hmm.
That doesn't take into account what does it mean to be a good person, or what does it
Hmm.
mean to be a human, as you're always saying, or or thinking
Hmm.
about what does it mean to live well. Uh, and so, in my, I guess in my mind, the sadness of all of this is that it's reducing humanity down into this very small category of like the goal of your life is to. It's like I was saying this the other day at a university. Like, why are you sitting here? Okay, you're going to study for this amount of years in order to get this job, to work at that for 40 years, to put money into a retirement account so that you can then, retire and do what? Like you can make this sound like a pretty bleak life if you put it just in terms of economics very quickly. And everybody who stops to think about it knows that that's true. And so all of a sudden, then the questions of like, what does it mean to have a satisfying life? Or what does it mean to have satisfying relationships with other humans? Or, all of that richness that we're craving,
Hmm.
we're not pursuing. It like that sounds weird coming out of my mouth to phrase it like that, but it feels true to me that the things that we want the most are the things that we're not paying the most attention to. I can't quite
Well,
phrase that right, but
there's a book that came out,
does
a
that make
science.
sense?
Yes, there's a science fiction book that came out that makes the very point you're making by Catherine St. John Mandel. It was called Station 11, and in the book, this is a familiar dystopian premise. There's been a plague that's wiped out a significant portion of humanity, and so the fragile remnants who have survived have devoted most of their resources and most of their thinking to just trying to stay alive. But the book is
Fighting
about
zombies, the classic.
there you go. But the book is about a traveling troupe of Shakespearean actors and remnants of a symphony who have somehow kind of it's a little maybe it strains credibility a little bit, but they've all discovered one another and they're traveling around kind of caravanning performing Shakespeare with music and everything. And their motto is survival is insufficient. And that sounds really
Mhm.
profound, except that they lifted that from Star Trek Voyager. But which gives you a good chuckle.
Survival is insufficient.
But the theme is what you were just saying. We are more than just organisms surviving. We're human beings, and it's the quality of our existence that matters as well. Our relationships, the way we cherish and relish our experiences, and and also pursue a life well lived. So that would include actual righteousness. So these are all things that used to be hallmarks of a liberal arts degree. It was all about asking the big questions. Why are we here? What is the good life? Those are all laughed off in most secular universities now as hopelessly naive, relics of a bygone era. But look at the state of our culture right now. It's not direct. That's not all due to our universities, but that's part. But it isn't. It is in part due to them. Yes, we are we reflect what we
But the
value.
universities are a reflection and a byproduct of where our culture is. So
absolutely, yeah.
It's not blaming. Again, it's not blaming universities here.
But here's a larger point that I want to make. So the humanities help you to think well, and they cultivate independent thinkers as well. So that's actually, so you want to talk about, you can bring in a hideous phrase like market value. There actually is market value to that because less and less people are able to do it. And I don't care how much AI we have, how sophisticated it is, you still need human beings who can string together sentences and who can think and articulate themselves. And by and large, more and more people are having, especially in really competitive tech fields, they've got people who are highly competent technically, but who simply are inarticulate. And this is becoming a growing problem. But more and more, we've talked about this with my dad before, Nathan. I was talking to him about this yesterday. More and more, some of the smarter people I know are no longer thinking. They're not thoughtful anymore because they are unwilling to slow down, get off the frantic treadmill of incessant content, and actually reflect and actually think. And the humanities are all about slowing you down. It takes a long time to read East of Eden. You've got to slow down. It takes a long time to work your way through these. Yeah.
You use the word reflect, and I think most people would say, hey, having a mirror helps you better understand yourself to some degree, maybe a superficial level, but mirrors have been used for a long time in trying to understand ourselves. The humanities function as a mirror for human existence. Like, it gives you something to look into and reflect off of in order to understand yourself and the world and humanity in a deeper way. And I was just working on something for this weekend of some stuff in scripture of saying, how does, looking at this group of stories, what does this tell us about God and what does it tell us about humans? And you've often said, Cameron, I read scripture because it describes reality. Well, therein lies this interesting thing where you're assuming that history, and even the parables, stories that maybe didn't historically happen, but were parables that were told to illustrate a real point, that all of this is educational, informative, and valuable to us today. So there's almost a sense that if you run this to its logical conclusion of we don't need the arts and the humanities, you're not going to be surprised to find yourself living in a culture that says, well, we don't need to read scripture either. I mean, because there's no amount of time that, you're reading scripture that tells you how to invest in the stock market wisely or whatever, pick your poison there. So there's, I think to me, I think we can see enough in the culture around us that shouldn't surprise us that this is not a priority for our modern educational system.
And
it's reflected in the church, is what I would say.
It is, yes. Look, there was an article, The Onion always says it best in their headlines, right? And I think it was something to the effect of, guy who sucks at being a person sees great potential in AI. And there was a comment below it. I know you always say, don't read the comments, but I did. I wanted to know. And one guy on there said, all you artists who think you're special, who think humans are special, your fear is showing, LOL. And this is a direct quote, human sentience is nothing special. We are lines of code, and lines of code can be replicated. Now, do I think he actually believes that? No. Would he look at, say, an ailing friend or an ailing family member and say, hey, that's a fading line of code? I highly, highly doubt it, unless he's a psychopath. But that does describe, I think, sometimes the way a tacit understanding of humans is just, yeah, no, we're whatever is current is what matters. And the past is always moving, we're moving further and further away from it. It's obsolete. So we just need to focus on the here and now. So for me, one of the big questions behind all of this is, are we special? Are human beings really special? If we are, that means there's lasting yeah, I know that's not the way it's usually put, but are we special? Because if we're not, then that means that there really isn't any lasting insight possibly to be gained, unless it's of a technical nature. You know, you could read somebody like a Heisenberg or or Niels Bohr still, I suppose. But John Steinbeck, he made up a story. It's not real. Maybe we can gain some historical insights. And by the way, that's what humanities departments did for a while, didn't they? I mean, especially when deconstruction became all the rage. It was all the rage in France years before, but in the 90s it really took root here. Well, what did we do? We stopped reading them as stories and started mining them for sociological data and historical data, and looking at how racist was this article, this author, and blah blah blah. Not to say that those historical details aren't interesting, but if they become your sole guiding force and you explain everything away in purely sociological terms, well, pretty soon you've basically killed the story. And you've basically declared that only contemporary lenses make sense of this. Was the idea of trying to recover a sense of how people thought in ancient times. That's a very noble aspiration. It's not easy to do. Great historians will do that. Instead of trying to read all the ancient texts through 21st century eyes, they'll try to help recover a mindset of, say, somebody in the Middle Ages. That's a very noble endeavor, and it's amazing. It's an amazing act of discipline and empathy, and it requires rigorous thought and careful retrieval. These are highly valuable disciplines, but we jettisoned them for a while because underwriting that, again, is this kind of materialistic assumption. We're not special. We're lines of code. Lines of code could be replicated.
So time out. Yeah, time out though, because you tripped on the landmine that I was thinking about. So you said these are highly valuable. I think if I had to summarize the entire point of what we're trying to say in this episode, is that there are things that are highly valuable that are not economically valuable. And so I think that would be the thing that I would say to everybody listening. You're going to continue learning. I don't care how old you are listening to this. It's not like your education stops when you're 22 and finish your undergrad, or when you're 52, or when you're 60. Like, you're always learning. And so I think pursuing learning the things that are good to know, even if they don't make you any money, is good.
It is.
If they specifically they make you more Christ-like, that's it's good for you. It's good for everybody around you. It's good for the world. It's good for so there are tremendous categories of value that don't have dollar signs attached to them. So the fun of learning something, or knowing something, or like letting your curiosity function in non-economic categories, I think is one of the beautiful things that the church should be at the forefront of preserving. So I think for a secular university, yeah, I understand they don't want to teach theology. Fine, whatever. I think moving forward, it'll be the Christian oriented minds that will have to preserve some of these categories. And I mean, you see this, even your local public school. Okay, funding is short. What are the first things that get cut? Maybe music, art, whatever. Arts programs. We always see that. However, if you look historically, the church has been the institution and culture that has preserved and developed the arts. So there's a sense there, I think, is extra sad when you have a Christian associated or affiliated institution that's dropping those categories, because
they're following,
that used to be the baby that we cared for.
They are following in lockstep with the culture rather than having their feet firmly planted.
But maybe that's a reflection of
church.
But maybe it's the Christian institution falling in lockstep with the culture. And so I'm saying, I think the challenge here is for the church to think collectively. How do we cast a vision of knowing good things for the beauty of honoring God with our mind? Even if
the life of the mind has always been a very cherished and, absolutely essential to the Christian way of life. So to see this in, some of these universities is sad. and I pray and hope it changes.
How are you, Cameron, real quick, how are you going to help your kids with this? Because we can say, culture out there in the church, this and that. But I mean, in our own homes, don't we have a,
Hmm.
a broader capacity for challenging this or introducing this? What's, you have any quick thoughts on this?
We do. Well, I mean, some of the basics are, so read to your children. This is how a love of literature was instilled in me. I know that that was part of it for you, Nathan. And also,
Sure.
don't one of the practices that I have in my household is I'm trying to steer away from giving my kids instantaneous answers to technical questions, because Dylan will already say to me, you can just Google this. I can, or we can pursue it a little bit and look for it a little bit, and actually I want to actively engage your mind. Heather and I are both, from the very start, we her we wouldn't say it like this exactly, but we are Socratic with our kids. We answer so many of their
Mhm.
questions with other questions. Socratic or rabbinical, depending on how you want to look at it. But on and on we go, because we want two things. We want to help our children learn to articulate themselves, and we want them to think, to actually be thoughtful, and to
Mhm.
value thought for itself. But also, yeah, sitting. I think I mentioned this earlier, but reading, say, A Wrinkle in Time with my son. Madeline Langle really loves the word swift. She uses the word swift all the time, swiftly. And Dylan says, "Well, what does swift mean?" I said, "Well, it means fast." "Well, why doesn't she just say fast?" "Well, this is describing an angelic being with wings, you know, and moving swiftly. And the word swiftly sounds
Mhm.
better. It gives you a sense of, whistling wind, even, or something like that. It conjures that image more powerfully than fast. Fast would do the would be efficient, I suppose, and it's an easier, it's
S-
a more universally understood word, but swift is the better word. And so sitting there just taking time to
You're
talk
looking at
about,
a
yeah,
you're looking at a high you're pursuing a higher level of communication and the possibility of
yeah, it's all
transferring
about talking.
information
It's
more
all about
precisely.
communicating with your kids, though, isn't it, Nathan? I mean, I talk to people over and over again, and I'm finding that this is a rarity, because it takes,
Mhm.
our cultural moment is pretty poisonous in so many different ways, and one of them is that it's construed children as this huge burden. And because if life is all about ease and convenience, kids are a huge threat to that. And so all the humor, even surrounding kids on social media and all that, revolves around how they've destroyed your sense of, they're making you old, they've destroyed your sense of comfort and ease, and they've taken from you all your freedom. So if that's your mindset, you're going to try to find ways to pacify your
Boo.
kids all
Yeah.
the time. But if you've said, no, life is all about actually giving and self-sacrifice and selflessness. That's actually written into the fabric of reality. And you don't need to have kids, by the way, for that to be true. I mean, human relationships, if they're going to be real relationships, will demand compromise and sacrifice of all of us. But if you have kids, obviously you feel this. You have to talk to them. You have to
The
communicate with them. And that's, if you could just do that, you don't necessarily have to read, really complex books with them right away or anything like that, although it certainly doesn't hurt. But if you talk to your kids, talk to them lots, ask them lots of them, get there, hear from them, and have them, even if you know what they're going to say, have them articulate themselves. It's painstaking sometimes and it might feel cumbersome, but you are doing them immeasurable good by undertaking that pursuit.
Mhm. We've for the last several months been on a little kick of, so everybody gets their pajamas on, teeth brushed, and all this, and they're 11, 9, 7, and 4 right now. And then we sit in silence for 3 minutes. So we set a timer, and actually the kids love this routine. So we sit in silence for 3 minutes, and then my wife reads. Right now we're reading in Mark, so just a short paragraph or two, some pericope. And then what we found is every time that she would finish, everybody, what about like 5,000 questions? So what we do now is as soon as she's done reading, then we have 2 minutes of silence. So 3 minutes of silence, read a passage, and then we all just sit with our thoughts for 2 minutes, and then we ask our questions. And so then it turns into a fascinating Q&A. But what we're doing there is showing them that if you sit quietly for 2 minutes, you can probably answer some of your own questions and get down to what the good ones actually are. And so that makes it much more fun to see them answering their own questions just by slowing down and thinking about it for 2 minutes. And so, yeah, the sacrifice there is like 6 minutes, 5 minutes of quiet time with a minute of reading in it. But it's actually pretty great. It's a lot of fun, and it amazes me what comes out of their little minds and the questions and the connections that they can make. And so, yeah, that's not a phenomenal amount of time in my day, but it's really, really valuable, and I'm learning in the process as well. So, yeah, there's that kind of slow down. See if you can figure this out on your own for a minute or two here before you ask the question. Yeah, you're engaging with a historic ancient text, but it might also be the revelation of God, and it tells you something about who you are and who God is and how to relate and respond to other people and to the things and the creatures that are around you in the world. And so it is a good way to be, and they're good skills to learn. So anyway, that's one of the little ones we've been working on there that kind of help us in the evenings before we have our prayer time and sing and go to bed.
So, yes, I mean, this is one of those topics that we will come back to, because it's, yes, obviously it's in tension, profound tension with our cultural moment. And of course, Nathan said it best. Of course, Christians, we cherish one particular ancient text. And so we are in the habit of reading old books, 66 of them to be precise. But we hope this has been helpful to you. I hope actually that this episode has slowed us down just a little bit so we can reflect, because it's valuable to do so. But you've been listening
as you continue your Christian education.
Yep. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.